Back with me, Republican pollster Chris Wilson, Democratic strategist Chris Kofinas. So Chris Kofinas this morning, the headline in the New York Times said, Mike Capuano is in the political fight for his life. Look, the way Ayanna Pressley put it to me is, being a progressive is not a reason to vote for someone. In a district like this, that was JFK's, that voted, I think, 13% for Donald Trump. It's part of the basic job description. She is arguing that this is a majority district, and she reflects what this district is and where it's going. Is that something the Democratic Party needs to look at?
I mean, absolutely. I mean,
will voters look at it?
I mean, possibly. I mean, it's really tough in a district like that where you don't, I mean, one, you probably have not had any really good polling. It's tough to poll in a district like that. As you mentioned in the piece, you know, what is the turnout model when you're talking about essentially two progressive candidates? But there's a generational shift that happens in politics at various points. And we're clearly, I think, going through one right now in a lot of different ways. We saw that in the last, I think, few presidential elections, this desire for a new voice, a new direction, irrespective of whether they are ideologically that distinct. And in this case, I'm not sure there's much of a difference on the major policy issues between these two candidates.
No, and they'll both say that. And in fact, when you talk to people who support each candidate, they have nice things to say about the person they're not going to vote for.
Right.
So, Chris Wilson, Mike Capuano was at a breakfast this morning. It was a labor breakfast. Senator Elizabeth Warren was also there. I want to play for you what she said.
Here's my promise. You give Democrats power in Washington, you give us back the House and the Senate, and Democrats will be there for unions and for workers across this country.
And yet, Chris Wilson, in this race with a 20-year Democratic incumbent, she has not endorsed either candidate. What do you make of that?
Profiles encouraged there by Senator Warren. You know, I feel for Chris Kofinas in this situation because this is kind of what we went through on the right in the Republican Party in 2010 and 2012. They're having their own Tea Party revolution. And, you know, back when we went through that, there were a lot of people who lost their seats because they had voted for big government programs, bailouts, Obamacare, things like that. But then you also had kind of what you're talking about here on the left with the Democrats, which was sort of an insider-outsider situation where people may have been ideologically the same, but the outsider was able to beat the insider just because they were the outsider. They had never run for office before. Now, in some of those situations, we recognized our mistakes. And I'll give you an example where Alaska, where Lisa Murkowski lost her primary to someone who's less qualified than she was, but then went back on the ballot in the general election and won through a write-in situation. I think right now Democrats are witnessing, and Ocasio-Cortez is an example of this, some people who have been nominated are now becoming under the spotlight saying, well, maybe that's not who we want to have as the face of the progressive Democratic Party, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. But even more interesting than this and what happens in this election tomorrow is the implications for 2020. Does this mean that a white male can no longer be nominated by the Democrats? What does that mean for a Bernie Sanders? What does that mean for a Joe Biden? And I think the future of the Democratic Party and the face of the Democratic Party is going to be defined by what's going on in these districts with the re-election of someone like Capuano. And it is interesting just to observe from someone like me who has no vested interest at all in what happens.
Because the Democrats going to win. Real quickly, Chris Kofinas, we've got less than a minute left, but we talk about this blue wave. If you look at what the polls that have been done show, Ayanna Pressley absolutely crushes Mike Capuano with minorities and with young people, but they traditionally have not voted, right? It is the older white people who get out to vote, the voters who are more consistent. What is this going to tell us? Do you think that this is something to look at to say, hey, maybe the blue wave is a real thing. Those young people, those minorities aren't just going out and marching and holding signs, but suddenly there is going to be a whole different model for who gets out and votes.
I mean, I'm not going to read too much into a district that Democrats are going to win, irrespective of who the candidate is. I mean, to me,
that would be all the more reason for people maybe not to get out and vote, though, don't you think?
No, I actually think what you have here is two personalities, and it's going to be the strength of their personalities and campaigns that are going to determine whether they win. But I think to your question about, you know, what are the indications of a blue wave, to me what's really interesting is you see what's going on, for example, in Texas, in Florida, where you have Ted Cruz in a very conservative red state, really on the ropes against a candidate that really has come out of nowhere in terms of this generational shift, I think, that Democrats are trying to exploit, that the American people do want a different type of politics. And I think you're seeing that play out in Texas, in Florida, in Arizona. And this is why I think there's the the strong possibility that a blue wave, if you will, is growing. Is it going to happen? It's still 2 months, still a lot of work to do, and so I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I would rather be in a Democrat's position than a Republican's position come November.
Chris Kofinas, Chris Wilson, we'll be talking again, I'm sure, between now and then. Thank you both. And